Wavelength.
Mental illness doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Alcohol addiction, abuse, misuse is the same all over the globe.
Sparking the combos about Adelaide.
So it made me feel very confident that if we did have it in the state, we were going to know about it.
You should be having.
There'll be guys that are trained, but they don't feel like they're good enough to take their shirt off.
Almost everyone is a culprit of doom scrolling. Anyone who has a mobile phone.
On Fresh 92.7.
Welcome to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. I'm your host, David, and tonight I'm joined by Aj. How are you doing, man? Good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be back. I haven't been on the show in ages because I'm just working so much all the time. I can never get into the studio.
It's okay. It's good to have you back anyway. We've got a massive show for you guys tonight, though.
Yes, we do. So tonight on Wavelength, we're asking whether the government has failed refugees in Australia. Right now, there's around 10 men in temporary detention facilities in Adelaide brought here under the Medevac bill that's been repealed. They've been there for more than 2 years. So what's gone wrong with the system?
Wavelength is also going to explain why the vaccine rollout is so damn slow. But next, we're letting you know about a UN youth program that wants your opinion.
Wavelength.
So maybe these last few years have left you feeling a bit voiceless, a bit powerless and a bit frustrated at the state of things. COVID only accelerated those feelings for many young Australians who feel unrepresented by those who make decisions. A new UN youth program, however, is hoping to capture those grievances as part of a new tour around the country. Here's Amila with more.
Wavelength. On Fresh 92.7.
Almost 20 years ago, the United Nations created a youth representative to consult with young people around Australia. This year, their focus is on asking young Aussies the question, what would Australia look like if they were the key drivers of decision making? To see how the tour is going and what it involved, I talked to 2021 UN Youth Representative Lucy Stronach.
It is my job to represent and amplify the voices of young Australians throughout the country. So, primary portion of my role is spent travelling around Australia conducting the largest face-to-face consultation of young people. So I speak to young Australians under 25 from every state and territory in regional remote areas and metro areas. And basically I can collect their thoughts, their experiences, their ideas and discuss the issues that they're most concerned about, but most importantly, the solutions that they see as needing to be implemented to help mitigate some of those issues. I then get to collect all of this data and this information and basically give it to our policymakers and our change makers to ensure that young people have a say in the discussions that are being had about changes in our society, and I also deliver my findings to the United Nations itself.
So what personally got you interested in doing this tour?
So I have a strong background in social justice. My favourite area to work in is particularly juvenile justice and youth advocacy. So my background's actually in criminology and counterterrorism and legal studies. And so throughout my last sort of 10 years at uni and in this space, I've spent a lot of time working domestically and overseas with young people, particularly young people from marginalised and disadvantaged backgrounds. And having worked with so many incredible, passionate, engaged young people from these backgrounds, it really demonstrated to me that young people do have a voice and it needs to be heard. And so I was lucky enough to secure the role of youth rep, and I feel very privileged to be able to basically be somewhat of a platform for young people to have their say.
So what response are you hoping to see when you take your findings to the UN?
So I'm not actually hoping to see a particular response because it's not my job to really have a strong opinion this year. It's just my job to actually amplify the opinions and voices of other young Australians. However, we have found a few key things so far on my tour that has been primarily to do with our health systems and the issues around accessibility in terms of wait list times, in terms of the cost of mental health and psychology sessions and the issues of navigating that space. We've found issues with the welfare system and the housing system, climate inaction, which is something that young people are incredibly concerned about. Gender inequality is raised quite a lot as well, unsurprisingly with what's happening at the moment in terms of the Australian government. And ageism is brought up really frequently. So the issues that young people are not being listened to, not being respected, not being heard, and that action isn't being taken on the issues that young people see as most concerning.
For the young Aussies who don't think their voice makes an impact, what would you say to them?
That's not true at all. I think it is quite easy to feel like we don't have a voice as young Australians. I mean, a lot of us can't vote, but that doesn't mean that we can't make change and that we can't take action. When young people mobilise and work together and unite, they are an absolutely unstoppable force, and we've seen that through things like the school strikes for climate. I have seen on the ground young people working together through these consultations, external to these consultations, and once they start talking to each other and discussing their ideas and working on their solutions, they're making real change in their communities and in our country. So I don't think it's true at all that young people can't make a difference. You guys have a voice, you just need to make sure it's getting heard.
And when will the youth of Adelaide get to see you?
So I'm arriving at the end of April, and I'll be doing my listening tour and my consultations throughout April and May in Adelaide, and actually wider South Australia. So I'd be very, very keen to hear from young people in South Australia. If anyone is under the age of 25 and wants to reach out to host a consultation with me, please do get in contact with myself or my team.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That was Amila chatting with Lucy Stronach, the 2021 Australian Youth Representative to the UN. And if you want to get in touch with Lucy, head to ausyouth.unyouth.org.au.
Wavelength.
So right now there's around 10 men in temporary detention in Adelaide. Some of them have been granted refugee status, meaning we can't send them back to their country of origin.
Yeah, that's right, David. I spoke with Mohammad Bavie. He's at the ATA facility in Adelaide.
Mm-hmm.
He's a refugee from Iran, and he spoke about his lived experience as a refugee. I also spoke with Professor Alex Reilly, an Adjunct Professor of Law from the University of Adelaide.
Yeah, really interesting two-part story coming up. But in part one, Aj spoke to Mohammad about what he suffered at the hands of the Australian government.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
8 years, no reason. That's the cry of the men who are still locked up in detention centres around Australia for daring to seek asylum in the lucky country. Here's Mohammad Bavie with his story.
2013, I get off from my country. I arrived to Indonesia, and after that, I came with boat and arrived in 9 August 2013 in Christmas Island. I was in Christmas Island for 5 or 6 months. After that, sent me to Manus Island until 2019.
Did the government speak to you about why you fled or what you were fleeing from to sort of determine whether you were a refugee or not, or did they just simply detain you in Christmas Island and then Manus?
We gave case in Manus Island and got refugee assessment.
So you got a refugee assessment in Manus Island?
Yes.
And what was the outcome of that assessment?
2016, I got that. After that, who is got refugee can participate in processing center for USA.
You were on Manus. You remained on Manus. You obviously didn't go to the USA. So then, after you were given refugee status, why were you still held at Manus?
I don't know. You should ask from Australian government.
So the Australian government acknowledges that you're a refugee, and yet they're still holding you in a detention facility.
Yeah.
And 2 years ago, they medevaced you guys from Manus Island into what they're calling temporary detention centres.
Yeah, almost 2 years, 22 months I'm here.
And now, since then, they've let some refugees out on very poor protection visas. They're pretty much not protected at all. But some of you are still in the temporary detention centre, and from now what I understand is you're being held there in a temporary facility despite having an acknowledged refugee status by the Australian government. Is that correct?
Yeah. I came under medevac for treatment. Here almost 2 years I'm here, but I didn't get any treatment. And I asked about my situation or my future from when my case manager called me. I asked about that. Never answered to me. She told me, I don't know. I just said that one. I don't know.
And what's that uncertainty been like? What's it like living with that sort of uncertainty over your own future?
We're living here some like animals. Just I don't know what's about my future.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say, Mohammad, just on the situation that not only yourself, but so many other refugees fleeing from Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Sri Lanka? Is there anything else that you'd like to say on their behalf?
That people, everyone who is escaped from his country and leave his family to find better life. But what we did find here, just torture, something like that, from the Australian government. Not really life. Nothing. We didn't find anything else. Torture.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Thank you for that, Arj. That was a very, I'd say, confronting interview and a very unique perspective. It's not often you get to hear from people that are in these situations, and it's quite chilling to know that this man was on Manus Island, sent here on the Medevac bill to receive medical care, never received it, and has been here for years.
You know what's actually worse about that? Before they were medevaced from Manus, I'm not sure if you remember or the folks at home remember, but the government actually switched off the water and they switched off the electricity and they stopped supplying food to the refugees on Manus in an effort to get them to another detention facility because PNG actually deemed it was illegal, an illegal facility.
I remember that.
So he spoke about that as well. And he said they actually sent in guards and other people from Papua New Guinea to beat the refugees who were there in an effort to get them out. So the Australian government might not have done it themselves, but they definitely contracted it out.
That's terrifying to understand and to learn. This Mohammad, he is in Adelaide now, yeah?
Yeah, he's in Adelaide now. So he's been there for 2 years.
Just in a detention facility in Adelaide,
Yeah, and the government acknowledges that he's an actual refugee. So they said, yeah, you've genuinely left in fear of your life from Iran. You can't go back to Iran, but we're not going to take you.
Why not? Why won't they let them out?
It's just because they are refusing to accept anyone who came here by boat.
It's awful. I mean, there's no words to describe how confronting that interview was. Thank you so much for getting out there and actually speaking to Mohammad. It's very impressive.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to also thank Mohammad and Refugee Voices for allowing me that opportunity.
Later on in the show, you're speaking to Professor Alex Reilly, so we're definitely very keen to hear more about that.
Yeah, no, he walks us through all the legal hurdles that they face after they've been released.
Wavelength.
We'll be getting back into our story about Australia's forgotten refugees very soon, but now we're cracking into our weekly segment where Hamish explains what the hell has happened this week.
What the hell is going on this week? Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
The national vaccine rollout is quickly becoming more chaotic than the launch of the COVID Safe app for ScoMo, who blamed low numbers on missing doses from Europe.
Europe. I wrote you, but you still ain't calling. I left my cell, my pager, and my home phone at the bottom.
He also had to concede that the AstraZeneca version of the vaccine, the one we were all a little bit sus on, may not be the safest option for those under 30 due to the rare side effect of blood clots. Which would be fine if he hadn't only ordered the AstraZeneca vaccine. Luckily, he's now picked up 20 million doses of the Pfizer jab off eBay, used but like new. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was sacked from his new position on the Net Zero Emissions Board after suggesting a moratorium on new coal mines. His boss, Energy and Environment Minister Matt Keane, said Mr Turnbull understands renewable energy and the science of climate better than anyone. He just doesn't understand politics. The Adelaide Crows have revealed they're in talks over a mystery site in the hunt for their new club headquarters. This comes off the back of being rejected for previous offers at the Thebarton Oval, the Adelaide Aquatic Centre, the abandoned Hungry Jack's on Main North Road, the old HQ nightclub, and about 20 local recreation centres across the state. It can only be assumed that their latest bid is for the Wiggly Worms building that was due to become a sex shop. And in news that proves WA is even more of an enshrined utopia than Adelaide, crowd capacities have been restored to 100%. Yes, 100% at all sporting venues across the state. Meaning we'll soon be seeing crowds like those in Texas, just without the extreme risk of infection, a lot less Confederate flags, and an additional 20 IQ points across the board. Finally, it's with sadness that we learn the news of Prince Philip's passing away over the weekend, dying at the ripe old age of 99, meaning he just missed out on a long-awaited letter from the Queen. And that's what the hell's been going on this week.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Before the break, we heard from Arsh speaking with Mohammad, a refugee from Iran who's still inexplicably in detention. But next, Arsh, you're going to speak with Professor Alex Reilly, who can walk us through the legal hurdles that these refugees face.
Exactly, yeah. There's not a lot of protection that refugees have once they've been released from detention. So even though some of the refugees in Melbourne and other states have been released, which is great, at least for their temporary mental health, they still have a lot of issues facing them once they're out and about in the society.
Fantastic. Well, here's Professor Alex Reilly chatting with Arch.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
I had a chat with Alex Reilly, an adjunct professor of law from the University of Adelaide, about the bridging visas that refugees have when they're released and the legal hurdles they have to overcome once they arrive.
So a bridging visa is generally a visa that you have while you're waiting to get some other sort of visa. This is a bit unusual because there is no visa that people from Manus can move to. So the bridging visa really is just a holding pattern. The bridging visa, as I understand it, does come with work rights. One of the problems that a number of the men who have come over from Manus on these visas is that when the bridging visa expires, if they haven't applied to renew the visa, they can then be with no visa whatsoever. And there are men in that situation, which means that they have no protections whatsoever. So it's as if they're stateless within the state. So they have no work rights, they get no government benefits. And really the only way they are surviving is that the charity sector is stepping in.
Can these asylum seekers be forcibly deported?
Each one of them is in a different situation because, of course, they tried to come to Australia seeking asylum. While they've been on Manus, they have been processed and some have been found to be refugees. They can't be deported to another country because that would breach Australia's non-refoulement obligations. They can't really deport them to a third country unless that third country guarantees that they won't send them back to the country of origin. So that's sort of an obligation Australia has. Another problem with deportation is that some of these men are from countries that just won't take them back. So even if they're found not to be refugees, for example, if you're from Iran does not take people who have fled that country back into the country. It's a really difficult situation. It's a situation that's been created by Australian policy. So the Australian government policy is that no one who arrived in Australia by boat and was sent to offshore processing will ever be resettled in Australia. So they stay in Australia with no prospect of settlement here, know that they're really not even meant to be resettled somewhere else to a third country, then they're just in Australia, either on bridging visas or on no visa, with no idea of what happens next. No one knows. I don't think the government knows what happens next. I'm aware of one person whose bridging visa expired and was not aware that he had to reapply for it. He was able to work and was working, but once his bridging visa expired, he wasn't allowed to work and he was scared to work. So he was then just living in his car until people found him and said, well, we need to help you. And when he tried to apply for a new visa, the government said, oh, well, the minister, you'd have to wait for the minister to decide, whatever that means. The government has had this sort of unshakable policy that people from Manus can never get a permanent resolution to their claim for asylum in Australia.
It seems to be a mixed bag of just policy that hasn't really been thought through. We've brought them over here for medical treatment, as was really required. And then we've said, okay, we'll let you out of what they call temporary detention, where they've been there for 2 years, on a 6-month temporary bridging visa. And then after that the government's kind of washed its hands of all responsibility.
That's right. No, the government has washed its hands of responsibility because in the government's mind, the government's view was they shouldn't be able to get from Manus to Australia even for medical treatment. So when they did come for medical treatment, they don't feel very responsible for them. But as you say, they washed their hands. And so in a way they've gone, well, we're not going to take any responsibility. You can either starve on the streets or, if you're lucky, the charity sector will pick you up and look after you.
All right, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
The thing I would want to emphasise is that the situation at the moment is not sustainable because when people were first sent to Manus Island and to Nauru, there was never any suggestion that 7 years later they would still be there. The idea was that they didn't get to Australia and they would be resettled in third countries. Now, the government has failed to find third countries to take people from Nauru and Manus. The only agreement that we managed to successfully enter was with the US, and the US did take a number, many hundreds of people from Manus and Nauru, but that didn't solve the problem. There are still people there. They need a permanent resolution to their claim. It has to be Australia that sorts it out. The numbers are so small now. There is no reason whatsoever not to just grant them permanent visas and be done with this whole terrible situation. It won't lead to boats starting again. The deterrent message has been well and truly sent to anyone who might consider going on a boat again. We haven't had boats arriving for many, many years, so we can solve this problem in a second.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That was Arj speaking with Professor Alex Reilly from the University of Adelaide, basically about a bureaucratic nightmare for people trying to seek asylum in Australia. And what I initially thought was some sort of loophole the government was going with is sort of more just like a giant black hole of a lack of policy, a lack of foresight, and a lack of care for anyone trying to come here.
See, I actually don't think it's a lack of foresight. I think it's very intentional. I think they are intentionally leaving it like this so that no one has even the thought of seeking asylum or refugee status in Australia.
Right.
I think because they've got to know that, you know, people who have fled from war-torn countries here, that 6 months temporary visa is not enough.
Yeah.
Right? And they've acknowledged, yeah, you're a refugee. You can't go back. But we're not going to grant you a permanent status in Australia. And that's got to be a conscious choice, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the frustrating thing about it all is like the professor was saying, is that these people have become stateless, essentially, just left without any country to go to. They're not going to be sent back to any country by the government. They're not going to be sent forward to any country. And they're also not going to be granted the rights to live and work in Australia. So they have nowhere to go. They have no citizenship anywhere. They have no right to work. And the right to work is something that is a human right.
Well, they also have no voice. So no matter how mad they get at the policy, they have no official voice. They have no power to enact change beyond protest.
I mean, if this story has got you as riled up as it has Arj and I, there is stuff that you can do. How about you tell our listeners, Arj?
Yeah, so every week, every Friday night, a group of protesters meet outside of the ATA facility here in Adelaide. So it's just off Churchill Road. It's in our backyard. It's not even, it's not out of sight, out of mind. It is here in Metro Adelaide.
Yeah.
So if you're as incensed by this as we are, every Friday night they'll meet up, and whether the government hears their voice is not so much to the point as that the refugees who are still trapped inside know that they're not alone, that they know that there are some Australians out there who actually give a damn.
That's it, Arj. Thank you so much for that story. Incredible stuff.
Wavelength.
Right now, we've got our weekly segment called Wavo Explains. This week, Jared is going to explain why the vaccine rollout has been so damn slow.
Wavelength Explains on Fresh 92.7.
Back in January, Prime Minister Scott Morrison had announced that doses of the Oxford, AstraZeneca and Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccines were earmarked to be delivered from overseas, with the National Immunisation Rollout Program set to commence in March, promoting an initial benchmark of getting 4 million people to receive their first jab by April. Instead, it has upended in poor diplomatic relations between the federal government, their state and territory counterparts, and the European Union arguing over who is to blame for the slow progression of distributing and administering vaccines to assist in the eradication of the COVID-19 virus, including preventing the spread of highly contagious variants from South Africa and the UK. During his press conference last week, Morrison half-heartedly accused the EU of withholding 3.1 million vaccines from being exported to Australia, thereby causing the underwhelming slow rollout of the vaccines in the states and territories to occur. Then he retracted those remarks, saying that he never once criticised the EU's conduct in this whole geopolitical stoush, even though he appeared resolute in deflecting his appalling mistake onto their shoulders without a proper explanation or apology. But another issue has since surfaced with a very rare and potentially deadly side effect of the AstraZeneca vaccine causing blood clots to form in adults under 50 years of age. They will now be offered informed consent over which vaccine they wish to receive, but because of this newfound risk, the later stages of the rollout will need to be readjusted. Then on Friday, a new deal was reached with Pfizer to increase our supply intake to 40 million doses, which is expected to arrive by the fourth quarter of 2021. Despite showing no accountability or an ounce of effective, transparent leadership in managing this rollout, Morrison is confident that increased supplies of both vaccines will help to bolster our stockpile and speed up the program so that it can reach its October deadline in getting the spread of COVID-19 under control and avoid any future outbreaks, lockdowns, or fatalities. But you have got to ask, are we really prepared to see the end of this pandemic?
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Jared explaining why the vaccine rollout has been super delayed.
Anyway, right now we've got our favourite weekly segment called Heaps Good News. This week, David, you've got the goods for us.
Yes, I do.
I know there's gonna be heaps good news on Wavelength.
In good news for the Aussie film industry, Godzilla vs. Kong is now the highest grossing movie of the pandemic era. Though it might seem like a glossy Hollywood flick, most of the work on the film was done here in Australia. Godzilla vs. Kong crossed the $60 million mark at the US box office on Friday, which means Australia's golden era of film is pretty certain to continue. One of the world's driest countries, Saudi Arabia, has announced plans to plant 50 billion trees and reduce its carbon emissions by 60%. Whether the announcement comes from guilt about it being the world's leading oil producer, the country hopes to usher in a new green era for the planet. It's a start, but it's great to see. In the coastal Australian town of Esperance, the community has come together to create jobs for 17 local disabled people after disability services provider Active Industries pulled its services after more than 40 years of activity. A new group called United has emerged in its place, creating community-led employment programs to replace Active, giving people jobs and helping the town's disabled launch their own businesses. And in Adelaide, just when you thought the Fringe was the end of our festival season, a new major winter festival has been announced. Called Illuminate, the Festival of Light, Arts and Sound will be running from mid-July to the 1st of August, with installations, concerts and performances bringing a bit of warmth to the city. Of particular note is a show from Aussie group The Avalanches, who will be performing their classic album Since I Left You in full with the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of the show tonight. Thank you guys for listening.
Make sure you're subscribed to the Wavelength podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can listen back to our old episodes right now, and you'll be the first to know when tonight's episode goes up.
That's right. And thank you so much for joining me this week, Aj. And thank you so much for your story on the problems that refugees are facing right in our backyard. We'll see you guys next Monday. You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.